Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. In the most important battles that he has seen in his lifetime, Pope Leo XIV has never been silent. He has used his platform even prior to being Pope to amplify the most silenced voices and to be with the foundations of the Church, its people. Who is the actor? Who is Leo XIV? In his youth, Pope Leo traveled around the world and especially went back to his land, Peru, and he immersed with the masses and was with the people. There are three things about him that we cannot forget to note in this round. Firstly, he let go of his privileged conditions. He did not live for a long time comfortably with the benefits of being a white American man. He has always had an interest to be with the masses, even before reaching a high station in the church. Second, his teachings have not always been based on theory. He's not just purely theoretical. He has preached on the ground and with the most marginalized Catholics all over the world. Thirdly, his politics are very obvious. He's anti-Trump, anti-deportation, and he frowns upon the idea of immigration policy in the US. He's pro-Palestine. He is an advocate for the urgency of climate justice. He has been very vocal about these issues and he has not been afraid to voice them even amidst the conservative regression across the world. TLDR, Pope Leo has always practiced his religion on the ground. He believes the church is the core of this religion, not just the Bible, not just our perception of God. He is not a purist. He is not detached from the people who actually worship the same God. All of them do. I want to then discuss three important things. Firstly, what does public denouncement look like? Second, why is it in the interest of Pope Leo as the actor? And lastly, I'm then gonna discuss the concessions that Gov is going to make, and I'm gonna preempt a bit of the stuff that Op might say. Firstly, then, why is it that, how is the public denouncement going to work? Firstly, he will probably tell the people that God told him in a prayer, that as God's representative on earth, he has manifested in my prayers and told him that all of this suffering is not for anything else. There is no more profound reason, and God only unleashes suffering for his entertainment. Second, this public denouncement will also include a call for the public to redirect their attention to social and political problems. Because we cannot control other disasters like health and weather, we ought to invest our efforts into evils on earth we can control, like evil and dangerous politicians who harm the people with the power invested in them. Thirdly, he's gonna say that the concept of God might be futile, guys, but the values we stand for still matter. He's gonna issue a reminder that this does not take away the importance of being good to your neighbor, of not committing evilhood, selflessness, being humble. The core of Christian values are important because these values will allow us the power to withstand the most imposing forces against us, which we now know is God. And this is especially important in the mechanization of the denouncement, because Op's case will be that the moment you denounce him, people will no longer value Christian principles. Again, if you are able to, if you're able to prove why is it that these principles are the reason you're able to survive in the first place, it doesn't really matter. If our responsibility to God becomes obsolete because he failed us, our responsibility to others must remain and we cannot fail one another. Second point of discussion, why is this in the interest of Pope Leo? Firstly, as a pope, as a leader of the church. Firstly, he owes it to the people, the church he served all his life. Second, he knows that everything the church has done was in service of the God everyone believed was benevolent. They deserve to know that the purpose of their service has always been false. And second, and most important, why is this in his interest as a person? Firstly, he will feel immense amounts of guilt. He will be essentially lying to the church in every sermon he gives after that. Every single song they're gonna sing, every single hymn of the choir, he knows all of these things are for naught. These are all lies. He will feel immense amounts of guilt exponentially as he continues to be Pope. Second, later, he owes it to himself to be honest. He will feel an insurmountable degree of guilt because he has seen and heard and felt with the exact same people who suffered under the whims of God. He knows that aside from the fact that he owes it to the people who have respected and also served him as someone who is in a high station in the church, he also knows he owes it to himself because all his life, everything he did was for a God who was not benevolent and for a God who lied, who was particularly misrepresented in the eyes of the people who served him. He owes it to himself as now the leader of the church and representative of God on earth. Before I proceed, I'll take the POI.
For people who cling on to religion as a last resort, like those with terminal cancer, how are you going to explain that their suffering is meaningless?
Okay, let's go. Now, I'm going to preempt. Op will say God is the source of hope and catharsis of people, and he ought not to take it away from them. Op can say that Pope Leo can just keep it to himself, and he can just carry the guilt on his own. Here's the thing, they're gonna say, let people have their false idea of God. But that is why my framing earlier was crucial. Pope Leo has seen mothers cry for the children they lost during the Black Death. He has seen the people drown in the storms God unleashed upon them. The guilt is not just heavy, it would be totalizing for Pope Leo. Keeping it to himself is something that goes directly against his principles. We think that he does not owe them a false idea of someone who is not true. He owes them clarity, and he owes them a more clear path towards change and towards the end of suffering that are within their control. Okay, like I already said earlier, all the things like weather, all these things, you can't control them. But every single other thing, we ought to use Pope Leo's energy and influence to redirect people's attention to that. These are things I already mentioned earlier. Now, I want to then be more comparative and even like discuss it even further. What are the concessions that Gov is going to make? And I'm even going to be so hardline in this part of my speech. Firstly, they're going to say the church will be harmed and even destroyed. And if you don't believe the things I said earlier about Pope Leo trying to maintain Christian values, this is something that OP is going to push. In the worst case, the church will crumble. Here's the thing, that's okay with Gov because Pope Leo knows the God they have all known for their whole lives is a lie. He knows that all of this was just a construct created for the purpose of religion. I would even go so far as to say that this actor, the moment he hears God in that prayer, he loses all faith in him, and the only faith he has left is in the people who he has strived to serve all his life. And this is something I've been saying since the beginning of my speech. I think that these are all things that will affect the way Pope Leo thinks, and it's fine for him, for the church to eventually fall and eventually end, because everything was a lie anyway. Lastly, they're gonna say, the church will hate you. Again, it's okay, because the frame I explained earlier, he has dedicated his life to truth, representation, and alleviation of suffering. If it means that people are going to be given more clarity and he has a power to alleviate some of that particular suffering and confusion, he's going to take it. That's within his principles as an actor, and I think that's the only thing that Op has to prove. If they want to run the case about giving people hope and catharsis, a thing to cling on, they first have to discuss why is it that Pope Leo is willing to carry all of that guilt, knowing that people are praying to nothing, people are suffering in the name of a God who doesn't care about them. All of these things have to be within your analysis of the actor, not just things that you're gonna assert as a third person looking in. For all these reasons and more, proud to propose.
If our responsibility to God becomes moot because he failed us, our responsibility to each other still remain. If God has failed the Pope cannot fail the people. And if God lied to the people, the Pope's responsibility is to give the truth that the people deserves at the end of the day. Opposition says that it is morally abhorrent to remove people's source of hope, but we think that it's more morally reprehensible to keep this information away from them and continue seeing them suffer from these disasters created only for this God's particular entertainment. At this point, we are already fundamentally unsure who this God even is, the benevolent and unconditional God that we were taught is no longer true. We think that if we are basing our hope on a false concept, it is better to not hope at all. This is where I will strategically position the extension, right? I will discuss why there would be alternative sources of hope that would arise anyway, and why even if at the onset we take away hope from people, we give them something else instead. We give them the clarity that they need. I think the concept of God may cease to exist with this revelation and we bite the bullet, but the values in which Christianity is founded is inextricable to the people who believe in that religion in the first place. These are values that one cannot take away just because God is revealed to be a horrible person. But even if these values shake and even become destroyed because people are now disillusioned by the idea of God through the denouncement, we suggest that we're okay with this because maybe it's time for people to base their values not on a concept but on what truly matters, on things that actually matter, for example, which is our brothers and sisters all around the world. I think this motion did not just come out of thin air, right? I think this motion, in the grand scheme of things, asks us to discern with everything that has happened and will happen in the future, like the looming threat of environmental destruction, the ongoing wars in the world, pandemics, and the existence of false gods like Kiboloy or Elon Musk. Is it still the most loving option to continuously believe that a grand plan exists? Or is it high time that we believe in something else instead, which is our capacity to defeat all the evils in which we can control, for example? We think that Pope Leo XIV owes it to himself and to the people who believe in him as the leader of the church to tell the truth and bring people to the end of their suffering, which God enacted only for his amusement. They said that once the white smoke declared Leo to be the new pope, every ounce of his individuality is stripped away from him. I think that this engaging later with the frame that his individuality, his commitment to being with the people, and his on-the-ground experience with suffering are all the reasons why he became the Pope in the very first place. So you cannot take away his individuality in opposition, because that's what made him the Pope in the first place. He has to be true to his principles if he wants to be the Pope that the Church believed him and voted him to be, for example. Just because you are Pope doesn't mean that you lose everything that you are. You may have changed your name, but you are still the person who went to Peru and helped these people. But before anything else, yeah, POI.
So just to clarify, for the principle of being honest to God, you are okay with the Pope causing infinite amounts of mental suffering.
Yes, we're okay with that, and that's the extension, right? So by the end of the speech, I'll explain why we get a better source of hope and why we get a better vision of the church. Firstly, let's talk about why there will be alternative sources of hope anyway, and why it is justified, for example, to give these people mental suffering at the onset upon this revelation. What happens after the public denouncement? We bite the bullet that people are going to lose hope. They're going to be disillusioned and they will probably lose faith. But we think that it's fine that they lose hope, because this hope is what enabled us to uncritically take every single death and disaster that has come to our lives to begin with. It's what enabled us to withstand every suffering, because we believe in a grand plan that does not even exist in the first place. So on our side, even if we take away people's hope at first, we think that people are now incentivized to look for other sources of meaning that are not reliant on the concept of God, but on tangible manifestations of the values that we believe in the first place. In things like love and care for other people, to see people rally in solidarity and community, for example, to see that people are able to use their agency and free will to defeat the evils around us which we can't control, for example, to know that we have the capacity to change the world, that even if we cannot control these disasters, because these disasters are enacted by God upon his entertainment, we can change the things that we can control, things like voting, for example, things like reducing our carbon emissions and things like that. To know that even if God is a bad person, for example, the people around us have the capacity to be good. We think that people will always look for sources of hope in times of calamity. We just think that there are better sources of hope even with this revelation, and we think that this is better for people in general. But even if there are no alternatives to hope, maybe it's time that we give people something else instead. Maybe it's time that we give them something that they truly need aside from hope. And maybe it's time that we give them clarity. Clarity that the suffering you're experiencing are not because there's a grand plan in the grand scheme of things. It's because of the systemic injustices that failed you, for example. And it's because you have to you have to acquire the power that was unjustly stolen from you. For example, these are things that would make your life more meaningful, because you're given the clarity now that in the afterlife maybe nothing will happen to you, but you can do something else while you're living in this earth, and that's enough for you. For example, to find another sense of meaning in life, even if now you think that God is not a benevolent person, even if you think that God is not truly unconditional, is not an unconditional loving father. Lastly, why then, even if it shakes or destroys every fabric that holds the church together, this is still something that is worthy as a trade-off, right? And this is where we bite the bullet that this is going to affect, and is going to create a massive backlash on the church, and this is probably going to ruin the church as a whole. I think this is where we engage on the macro scale impacts of that LO was talking about, especially how this will impact leaders in other religions. We think that for the vast majority of history, the church has acquired a lot of its power in the name of a benevolent God. What happens then when the church finally finds out that this God is really not benevolent? I think that the moment that we challenge this is the same moment that we allow the church to question itself and its role in society. The moment that we allow the church to change, for example, and to not necessarily enact all these forms of oppression in the name of a benevolent God. And I think that that's when we are able to make sure that the church is something that can change, for example, and something that's not just there to change its role in society and its meaning in society and the meaning that it gives to other people, right? We think that at the very end of the day, we were able to prove you two things. Number one, we were able to prove why hope is there are other alternatives and sources of hope, to the point that we don't necessarily need to rely on the concept of God in order for us to achieve that. But even if we don't get any other sources or alternatives to hope, we think that that's fine, because at least we give them clarity, and that clarity is something that will be enough for people to necessarily break away from the systems that, for example, created their circumstances at the very end of the day. And finally, we're able to explain why the church becomes a lot more better in our side of the house for all those reasons proposed.
The moment that the Pope reveals to the followers of the Catholic Church that their suffering is meaningless is to rid people of any form of belief that their individual actions would make an impact on social issues caused by a God who simply does it for entertainment. What use is there to, quote unquote, make an impact in a world that is simply a playground of a higher being? Three responses first that I want to make with regards to the other bench, right? Firstly, why is there an immediate call to focus on social issues unlikely to accrue? So this is something that they mentioned in their first speaker with regards to the model, right? That this is something that's going to happen after you publicly denounce God. Three responses to this. First of all, this questions the sanctity of the organization and his credibility to a certain religion, which I'm going to expound upon in my extension later. Secondly, a lot of believers are going to be politically confused because you have to note that a lot of these believers vote religiously or vote for candidates in the image of God, for instance. A lot of their actions are guided inherently by their religion. So to publicly confuse them would similarly be to confuse them with regards to how they act socially. But thirdly, this shakes the very foundational beliefs of these followers. And I wouldn't say it's going to be unfair to claim that it would cause an existential crisis on those who believe this, and the other side has conceded to this as well, right? But even if this significantly leaves their societal influence in such global issues, right? This means that when you publicly denounce God, you're causing such internal fragmentation within this religious organization that your entire influence and how you're going to be able to act and if people are going to believe you is going to be questioned altogether. Second thing I want to respond to, why is it not okay for the church to crumble? Three things. Firstly, the church has a significant global political influence. The Vatican is one of the only states, and therefore Catholicism is one of the only religions that has this type of power in the global scheme, right? This means that when you have such fragmentation, you're not going to be able to hold this same influence. This means that in terms of how you're going to be reacting to social issues and the things that you could actually do, you're not going to be able to pursue any of these things anymore because people don't believe you in the first place. Secondly, this is going to be bringing a large collective together, and I'm going to expand on this later on. But lastly, this questions the sanctity of every religion. And I'm not just talking about Catholicism, and this is directly responding to their claim that you have other sources of hope. Third and lastly, why is the Pope likely to relinquish his individual beliefs and this part of his identity? Firstly, we've already established that being Pope is a mantle of selflessness. You know already the things that are going to come with you when you actually get elected into this position. This is not just about you anymore, but this is about the people you serve. We agree. But secondly, Catholic Church is known to promote being a servant and martyrdom for the people. This is something that they completely forget on the other side, right? That a lot of these religious and political figures tend to sacrifice themselves for the sake of the greater good or for the sake of a higher being. This means that you want to pursue this collective image of salvation with regards to the collective. But lastly, joining the clergy entails a lot of sacrifices to even be able to get in. Sacrifices of your individuality, like leaving your families, clerical celibacy, and the ability to have a family of your own, and having to devote your entire life to this vocation. So I don't think it's going to be unlikely that this is something that he's not going to be willing to do, because he was able to sacrifice all of these things in his individual life to begin with. Two extensions to make with regards to this debate. Firstly, public denouncement would destroy the very principle of religion and not just Catholicism. First level, this questions its reliability as a place of solace. Historically, religion was created to firstly ease the fears of the unknown with regards to what's happening in the world, but secondly, provide a sense of comfort from protections for suffering. However, we have to note here that religion similarly never promised any form of certainty, and that the basis of religion in its entirety is faith. When you have nothing to believe in anymore, when you're questioning the very foundation of these beliefs, which religion then are you going to go to? Government tells you that they can be fully informed of where to seek solace, right? Two responses to this. First of all, this is going to be extremely unlikely because you're already acknowledging the existential doubt that is cast by this. But secondly, even if there's going to be a general distrust in every religion, because if you have a religion like Catholicism, which is already so large and influential, telling you that human suffering is meaningless, who is to say that other religions won't necessarily be preaching the same thing? But impacts then, why exactly is this bad? This because it, number one, provides more reason for religious persecution and backlash. This means that you have states and governments that are going to crack down on your religions and your religious spaces simply because of the fact that you don't have that sanctity and that protection anymore. But secondly, this removes the hope that is inherent in terms of caring for the world later. But on the second level then, and I'm directly addressing the part of hope here. This would hinder the communal and altruistic beliefs of the followers. In status quo, the Catholic Church is known to have a preferential option for the poor. This is to organize charitable initiatives and to be there on the ground in times of disaster to provide aid to these people in despair. How then is this going to change when you have this public denouncement? If suffering is going to be meaningless, won't being good also similarly being meaningless? If God is going to cause human suffering on earth for fun, won't he be letting people into heaven for fun? This questions then the very foundation of your religious morality. Where are you going to know what's right? Is it going to be right then to actually be able to do something about these social issues? How do you know that is right? This is because people are then lost without God telling them what to do, when this is something that they have been doing for all of their lives. Those in most desperate areas then, who are in need of immediate help, are not going to be able to receive this. But secondly, you're pushing a larger collective into individualism and isolationism. But go, POI.
Pope Leo made those sacrifices under the belief that God was good. We already explained why he loses his faith in God the moment that he hears what he says. So this means that he cares less about the principle of religion, but more about the state of the people.
But inherently, right, this belief that God is good is not just in God as a person. It's God in your religion. It's God in the doctrine. It's God in the communities. It's the teachings that you provide. Being Pope doesn't necessarily mean that you're blindly going to be following God alone, because that's not anymore what religion is about. If you want to say that Pope Leo is progressive, he is progressive enough to know the impacts on a large scale of what this would cause to the people. But second extension then, this shakes the communal foundations of the church. Religion and the belief of this is what brings people together. This looks like communal practice, like going to mass or Bible study, or bringing believers together as the foundation for other interests or pursuits. This changes because you now have a large amount of people who would choose to be alone, and this leaves people displaced from what they have known all their lives. Why is hope then going to be so important? This is because hope motivates social action and it provides mental comfort for the people. Without hope, people not only think that the suffering, which will exist anyway in both sides, is going to be useless to address, but also question their very purpose and place in society to begin with.
Start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The idea of a grand plan is a cage in a believer's mind, and the revelation is the key. The people deserves to be liberated, and this house, as Leo XIV, ought to give that key to the people. Religion is a social construct, and deconstructing it is the most monumental reparation to the victims of the greatest evil in this world, who is God. They want hope because it gives comfort, but the greatest comfort is justice, and that's what we give to the people. Let's talk about few things in this debate, or in this whip speech rather. First is that let's talk about hope and the alternative value that we've provided, which is clarity, 0 responses from Deputy Leader of Opposition. What they said in their side of the house is that there are many people in horrible decisions and that they look for hope exactly because of those horrible conditions, and they look for hope exactly because of those conditions. What we explained is that people can see hope elsewhere. We see hope in the faces of each other. We are inspired by the resilience of our neighbors during Bagyong Riming. But even then, what we explained is that we give them something better. We give them clarity. We give them something to be able to start the plans to be able to change their systems. We give them something that is required for them to be able to plan the things that they have to do for them to be able to change what's happening in their side of the house. So let's weigh. The first is, which burden is more tantalizing? Because they said taking away hope becomes a burden for this specific pope. But what we say is that there's more burden on your side of the house when this pope, Leo XIV, has been constantly always and always seeing the people suffering only for God to be entertained by those kinds of pains in the very first place. But what we do more importantly is redirecting the focus of those people from praying for the systems to change to actively participating in changing those very systems in the very first place. And this responds directly to the extension of Deputy Leader of Opposition about being able to make sure that people feel as if the things that they do still have an impact. Because what we do on our side of the house is tell them that what they do will really make an impact, because it is not as if they can just rely on God to be able to change things, and that those things will remain regardless. But those things are things that they cannot change just because they prayed. And what this does specifically, and which creates the margin, is which types of people, or in which side are people more likely to be able to change the things that are happening to them. On our side, it is exactly when people already know that they cannot rely on God, that they are more likely to vote for better people in office to be able to change the policies that exist, that they're more likely to be able to lobby for the things that they want in the very first place, that they're more likely to be able to help each other because they know that they cannot rely on something up in the sky to help them in the very first place. These are the crucial distinctions for the pains of the people, and these are the equipments that we provide on our side of the house to be able to lessen the kinds of pain that exist even for the people that we talked about with horrible conditions, etc., etc. What this means is in case of hope versus clarity, not only are we able to significantly co-op hope by telling you that hope can be found elsewhere, we explain why even if in the onset hope does not exist, something better exists, which is clarity. And on this, it is a clear win for government bench. Now, let's talk about the role of the Pope and his identity. They said Pope Leo is no longer just a white man, but he has now taken on the mantle of being a leader, a pope, or whatsoever. This case heavily relies on the success of being able to mute important pieces of identity of this person. But they are never really able to prove how they're able to do this. They said, oh, you're already able to forgo many parts of who you are already. But the crucial distinction that we have to take note is that those sacrifices are done exactly because Pope Leo believes that God is good, but now God is the greatest evil. And therefore, these sacrifices becomes even more costly for this person. Even if this person can do these sacrifices, there'd be more guilt in doing this sacrifice in the very first place. But more importantly, I'd like to be very clear about this. All of those pieces that you've forgone are pieces that are not aligned exactly with your identity as a person. So probably you can change your name, you can change like how you dress, but those aren't necessarily the values that you stand for, the things that you think are important, the purpose of your life. What that means is that exactly those are the things that cannot be muted from this person's identity, and therefore the moral guilt that comes from doing the decision on opposition bench is much, much greater on their side of the house. Before I proceed, I'll take the POI.
So before you're able to reach those alternative mechanisms of hope, millions of people still need to undergo the mental suffering of cognitive dissonance. So you're
And
okay with that before they reach it.
Yeah, and millions of people on your side as well will still be suffering and will still feel as if those sources of hope that you have are real, but they aren't necessarily real to begin with. But I think the most important thing to note here is that people will suffer on both sides. The question is, where will this suffering be channeled to on your side of the house? Because what we explained is that they're channeled in better places on our side, but more importantly, those are also the exact same people that will be victims of this God in the first place on your side. So they're still going to like multiple folds suffer, because not only are they suffering, they're being played with, they're being toys by the God that they believe in the very first place. And if there's something that is like worse than suffering, it's being played with, it's being taken, your humanity being taken away from you in the very first place. The next point that I'd like to be very clear about is on the moral compass, because I think there's a like weird claim coming from their side of the house that people will just be evil just because God does not exist, which is like a crazy claim, because it's not as if atheists are criminals or atheists no longer have a moral compass. Just like basic scrutiny, this case doesn't necessarily hold up. But the more important response to this is that we have long existed and created systems and structures to encourage goodness and minimize evilhood in the very first place. They exist in the forms of laws and policies. They exist in the forms of schools and teachers and education. They exist in the cultures that exist in different communities that tell you that you have to respect your elders, that you have to manage for your teachers, that you have to manage for the elders, or whatsoever. There are multiple ways that inform people of what is good, of what is moral, and what is wrong in the very first place. And the reason for this is because the values that we've taught in religion and in Christianity are values that are mirrored in many other aspects of the life. These are values that are also taught to these people via all other structures that I explained. Because God does not only exist up in the sky, God exists amongst us. God is each other. So on our side of the house, probably this kind of false moral compass will be taken away, but we don't think it's going to make people so evil. But more importantly, I think it also redirects the incentives of people to do good, because now they're not only doing good so that they can go to heaven, they're not only not doing bad so that they can go to hell, they're doing good exactly because they understand that we owe it to others to do good for them. It is our responsibility to make sure that we do good to other people or whatsoever. And what this means is that these actions exactly aren't necessarily actions that bank on some moral anonymity, but something that we know is a responsibility to one another. And with all those reasons, we're very proud to propose.
On the deathbed of my cousin-in-law, who was diagnosed with terminal stomach cancer, he shared to the family that he wanted to get better because during his time in prayer, he said and he believed that it is to make him a stronger man. I think it is quite a mystical interpretation of Catholicism to say that Leo or the Pope who interprets his own moral principles is okay to trump the moral principles of millions of others who rely on Catholicism for that last resort when it comes to life. So in this speech, I'm gonna completely debunk why this is something that's against the interest of Leo the 14th. The first question I want to answer is why is Leo the 14th someone who will never want to destroy the Catholic Church? And this is his interest as a person, as what was described by my previous speaker. And there are three things under this. The first is because of the Infoslide, right? He is a devout Catholic. He went to Peru in terms of proselytization, for example, which means that he also believes in the moral framework of Catholicism. That is, you have to do good in order to be rewarded, for example. And I'll explain later on why that's not the end all be all. But most often than not, it also means defying the message of God sometimes. Because if you look at status quo, Pope Leo the 14th, or even the late Pope Francis, never believed in the saying of God in the book of Leviticus. When in Leviticus, it was said that God wants to stone gay men, for example. So there are no explanation at all from government to say that Leo the 14th would want to always be consistent with the message of God, even if it's a direct conversation with him. Most often than not, he wants to promote the message of Catholicism as how it existed in the material world. The second is he was already influential even before popehood, right? So he was very progressive. I agree with the prime minister, which means that he cares for a lot of the social functions of the Catholic Church outside of its moral principles. What does this look like? We told you from Jap and Czerina that the Catholic Church actively contributes to structural changes in society. It looks like religious denominations of Catholicism organizing community protests in order to depose Marcos, for example, and other dictators, like what happened in Zimbabwe. It also looks like direct altruistic actions, like having soup kitchens in war-torn areas in Pakistan, for instance. And in last cases, right, wherein none of the structures can be changed, Catholicism provides a sense of solace. So, in conclusion, I agree with Sean that suffering will exist, but insofar as they never answered the question of you increase it inside government to an extent, then I don't think they win this oppression Olympics. But lastly, as a person, according to the info slide, and this is me in response to Prime Minister, he also finds solace in the church inherently, right? Because in the first place, the alleviation of suffering isn't the only pillar of Catholicism, according to Pope Leo XIV. It's also doing moral good. It's also enlightenment. And sometimes enlightenment means that people need to suffer alone or in the dark. So in conclusion, the Catholic Church is integral to the identity of Pope Leo XIV. While he is a person, he is also the servant of God and has been elected to represent not just God, but the millions of people who rely on his grace. What happens then if you denounce, right? These are the four mechanisms that were completely unresponded to by government. The first is on an individual level. You infinitely increase moral suffering of millions of people. Families with terminal cancer, for example, hope that it's just a struggle of the family and they're gonna get through it even after their loved ones die. For impoverished communities, right? That sense of community building is something that will exist because of the Catholic Church organizing it. Which means the guilt that the Pope will suffer from exists far more viscerally inside government because these are things that he will always have to contend with, right? Versus or vis-a-vis his singular interaction with God that just says that, well, I do disasters randomly for my fun, right? What about it? As long as you're protecting millions of people's mental stability, I think that is far more beneficial on a principled level. But secondly, what happens when you denounce in Gov is you destroy the sanctity of religious spaces. Now, conservative politicians, as was extended in the second argument of Czerina, know or believe that religions don't need space in society anymore because you can get everything from the establishment and from things like capitalism, which means that the last resort of the marginalized, the poor, the progressives in Peru, for example, will no longer have a shelter to call their roofs above their heads. I think that is a far more evil society that Pope Leo will know he directly caused. But lastly, it also makes Catholicism very individualistic.
POI.
So a lot of the social functions later will be gone, right? So things like volunteerism or even including minority believers in conversations that radically change how the clergy are elected or how religion is conducted in these spaces will no longer hold water because now people on the ground know that it is useless for us to form that structure and that organization. I might as well just pray alone in the dark, assuming that I don't convert into Islam or other religions. This is damaging to the Pope. Firstly, because you directly caused material suffering more on that debate. But secondly, because you increase cognitive dissonance, right? We don't really care for clarity because no one on the ground asked the Pope for this kind of clarity. They just wanted to escape cycles of suffering and just wanted to have that sense of hope. I agree that there are alternative forms of hope. For example, on that debate is you cause suffering first before you reach those alternative forms. I think the Pope would be much more fulfilled or much more contented, for example, if people suddenly change their belief, for example, outside of Catholicism and believed another religion, for example, as long as it happened organically, as long as it did not cause them mental torture and disregard for their own human souls. Why will the Pope be okay with divine guilt? The first is because he is a key figure in the Catholic Church, which means he consented already automatically to a lot of the kinds of harms that will impose onto him because of this position. The second is because, again, he is progressive. He is an altruistic human being, according to the framing of Prime Minister, which means he does not want to cause mental suffering, which means he does not want to cause physical suffering, which also responds to Deputy Prime Minister. I will flip the claim from DPM about alternative forms of hope because these things are better under our side of the house, right? Alternative forms like love, like caring for your neighbors, or even converting to another religion will only be far greater if you did not have the cognitive dissonance in the realization that God is evil under that framing. Lastly, in the worst case, that this is infinite suffering for the Pope, martyrdom is far more fulfilling. Letter A, it's because he did not blindly follow the church and believed in the greater good mechanism that's what's happening in status quo. But number two, it's also meaningful to develop that relationship with God, to actively defy that kind of message because you know it is evil and God himself is against Catholicism.
Opposition Whip says that part of being a devout Catholic is to sometimes defy what God says. We think that denouncing God is the ultimate act of defiance, challenging the fabrics of the church and allowing people to break free from meaningless suffering is the exact defiance that Opposition Whip was talking about. I will talk about 3 things in this reply speech. First, I'll deal with the paranoia that the church would crumble. Second, I'll discuss why hope persists even outside of God. And thirdly, I'll talk about why clarity is something that Pope Leo XIV owes to its people and why he is in a unique position to do this amid his other interests as a pope. Firstly, opposition says that this public denouncement would cause internal fragmentation in the church as a religious organization. My question is, why is this bad? Why is it bad to shake and destroy the fabrics that tie this church together? If the God, whose loving and benevolent name is the basis for all the actions of the church, turned out to be bad, why do we have to protect the church in the first place? We asked in a POI. Pope Leo made those sacrifices because he believed in a God that is good. The problem is that they don't explain why the God that revealed himself to Leo is not the same God that the church believes in. Obviously, they are the same God contrary to the answer in the POI. They needed to prove why Leo, with all the reasons why he became Pope in the first place, care more about maintaining the optics of the church and not about the misguided suffering of the people which he firsthand experienced, for example. All their flack about why it's still Leo's responsibility to hold the church together is dependent on them, assuming that Leo still has faith in God. We explained that at the very onset that he lost his moment the moment that he heard what God said in the first place. They never contested that Leo would lose his faith, therefore this claim stands and their push that Leo's responsibility to hold the church together is simply less important to him as a person and as a pope. Let's talk about hope secondarily. Opposition said that religion would end and people will lose faith. We We said that they might lose faith in religion, but at least they won't be suffering for a lifetime under the guise of a grand plan that does not even exist. On both sides, people will suffer, right? But on our side, the hope that we give, as in the hope that we feel from seeing others in solidarity with us and in believing in our capacity to change the evils that we can control, is a necessary tool for us to fight that suffering. On their side, their suffering is eternal with no catharsis at all. Suffering will be forever on their side, but it's worse because it is suffering that we just accept as part of our lives. This is a moral harm that Pope Leo is in a unique position to avoid and mitigate. But then they said that other functions of the church, like soup kitchens in Peru, charities, and volunteerism, would be illegitimate now. But I think that this is not genuine to what we said, that these things would persist because people believe in the capacity of people to do good even when their God is bad. They said that they don't like our alternative sources of hope because they would have to suffer first before they receive this kind of hope. But on their side, people would also have to suffer first, but they would have to undergo the disasters that God created for fun, for entertainment. The weighing is that this hope on their side results to no good. It's not meaningful. It doesn't allow them to change the systems that entrap them. In fact, their version of hope is what cages people to a lifetime of suffering and pain. We think that we give them the chance to escape on our side of the house. It's not as if suffering disappears in their version of hope, right? Don't believe them when they said that. It's just that you delay the pursuit of changing the realities that cause those suffering because your people are busy praying with their eyes closed and are unable to see the truth. But even if, in the very worst case, there's no hope at all, right? We think that we're still willing to let go of hope if it means that we get clarity. This clarity is crucial in allowing us to have a plan and purpose, in allowing us to know that we are our own person outside of God and that we have the capacity to change our lives. But their Hail Mary is that, oh, it's not hope and collective action that will arise. It's going to be fascism and evil and Aryanism. First of all, if they're accusing us of not building anything, like why love would arise, for example, as a new source of hope, they never built why nihilism or fascism will take rise as well, right? But more than that, we did build this. We explained why love is something that would probably arise, right? Because that would probably arise. I think it's a listening issue on their end. We explained that people are always going to want to survive. That's why they hope in the first place. We explained that the values of Christianity, such as love for your neighbor, will remain, and our responsibility to each other stands even when God has failed us. If they don't believe that people are inherently good, then the panel also ought not to believe that any form of hope on their side will be done in good faith by the people who blindly believe. So you have to vote for the team that sees the good in people, even in the absence of God. Thanks.